Clackamas County, sponsored by Sarah Aiken-Kent. Campbell. Ernie Munch, architect and urban planner, sponsored by Michael Templeton. Dr. Michael Adler, obstetrician, St. Vincent's Hospital, sponsored by Sarah Aiken-Kent. At the head table, we have Margaret Weil, who is owner of Classic Woods Unfinished Furniture and mayor-elect of the city of Gresham, sponsored by Diane Lopatin. Bob Evanson, architect and principal in the firm of Evanson, Lundgren, Larson, and Monahan, sponsored by John Bledsoe. Phyllis Losey, systems manager, Freightliner Corporation, sponsored by Katie Fole. And Cynthia Laska, secretary, Thompson and Rubenstein Investment Management Company, sponsored by Ann Kotkin. Our board host for today is Phil Bogue, who is treasurer of our Board of Governors. Next week, David Paradine, executive director of United Way, will be our speaker. That is Friday, June 25th. Mr. Paradine will discuss the changes in the human services picture occurring because of a depressed economy and government cutbacks. He will also address the concerns raised in the City Club's April 9th report on United Way and talk specifically about the issues that develop in attempting to implement some of the recommendations in that City Club report. That meeting will be held here again in the Mayfair Room. Today's program is second in the popular series, We've Made Our Economic Bed, But We Don't Want to Lie in It. Last week, as our viewers and listeners will remember, Richard Carlson from SRI International described our manure pile of anti-development problems. He also held out some hope of finding ponies of opportunity in the pile, but only if we're willing to put forth the proper effort to uncover them. The proper effort included some relaxation of our land use goals in the interest of making industrial lands available, some beefing up of our higher education system in the Portland area especially, but did not include restructuring of Oregon's tax system. Carlson said that an important part of a quick fix to the state's economic problems is development of a spirit of cooperation between government and industry, which brings us to today's episode. Governor Atiyeh appointed an Economic Recovery Council with 5 task forces: new industry, existing industry, Oregon's business climate, education, and tourism. Each task force was to study the problem of economic recovery in its area and make recommendations, which they did on June 1st. Business and industry were heavily represented on the task forces, boding well for Carlson's spirit of cooperation between government and industry, although the governor has not yet endorsed any of the recommendations. It is unlikely that in an election year he would endorse the more flamboyant of the recommendations. The sales tax was not popular with the voters in the early 70s when they defeated it 9-1, and the prediction is that today it would also be defeated, but only by 5-1. It is equally unlikely that he would endorse revamping of the state system of higher education at this time. Our speaker today was vice chairman of the existing industry task force and will talk about the reasons behind the council's recommendations. A copy of the council report can be obtained at the main office of the U.S. Bank if you're interested. C. Norman Winningstad founded Floating Point Systems, Inc. in 1970 and is now its chief executive officer and chairman of the board. He was born and raised in the Bay Area of California, and according to his resume, received a thorough education in vacuum tubes. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering at the University of California at Berkeley in 1948 after a stint in the U.S. Navy. He worked with Television California in San Francisco from 1948 to 1950 in experimental television propagation at ultra-high frequencies. He worked as electronics engineer at the University of California Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley from 1950 to 1958 on their 20 million volt radio frequency system. He moved north to work at Tektronix, where he introduced 2 product lines of over 18 products, which resulted in total sales of over $25 million from 1958 to 1970. He left Tech to obtain his MBA from Portland State in 1973 and formed Floating Point Systems as he became competent in business law, accounting, manufacturing systems, quantitative analysis, and finance. He is trilingual, speaking fluent electronic ease and business ease, and I presume English. He is president also of Aircraft at Your Call, a local air limousine service, is married, has 3 grown children and 3 very small grandchildren. He received an award for outstanding contribution in scientific research and technology from Reed College, was recognized as Associated Oregon Industries and U.S. Small Business Administration Business Leader of the Year. He was named National Management Association's Free Enterprise Man of the Year, and this year was given an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Pacific University. He is a member of the Portland Chamber of Commerce and on its Economic Development Committee, a member of the Beaverton Area Chamber of Commerce and on its Economic Development Committee, a member of the Beaverton Mayor's Economic Development Committee, a part of Portland State University's School of Business Administration's Advisory Group, and on the OMSI Board of Trustees Development Committee. Although I understand that Floating Point System has slowed down a bit and didn't quite double its business during the recession of the last 2 years, the success of Floating Point Systems has made you, Mr. Winningstad, the expert that your proximity and your lack of slides would otherwise deny you. The subject today, economic recovery and the School of Hard Knocks, the reasons behind the Council's recommendations. Mr. Winningstad.
Thank you, Mrs. President, members, guests. It's very difficult to give a talk after an introduction like that. It's quite difficult to live up to it, but we'll try. Oregon is at a crossroads, I think, and a lot of other people agree. I've had a good deal of feedback on this subject. We skipped the first half of the Industrial Revolution here in Oregon, the environmentally bad half, because our timber, agricultural, and tourist industries were quite good and quite sound. We didn't need the belching smokestacks and the steel foundries to have a prosperous state. With timber weakening, even in the long term, and our agribusiness facing continuing cost price squeeze, we need to change. We need to become a participant in the second half of the Industrial Revolution, become a high-tech power, a non-polluting industrial diversification. Build tourism, yes. Keep timber and the agribusiness going, yes. But let's construct a plan which will get Oregon a substantive piece of the high-tech pie and not the crumbs we've been accumulating. I'm referring to magnitude, not quality. I've personally observed the diverse efforts at economic development from small towns. I know, let's print a 4-color brochure, to the sophisticated Portland Chamber of Commerce carefully orchestrated study, plan, and action approach. I wrote a brief white paper which Jim Stewart called "The Emperor Has No Clothes" paper. The result was extremely encouraging in that I found, as a result of that paper and of participation on the Governor's Council, that almost everyone wants to help. One of the main reasons I'm here is to rally help and to attempt to persuade the doubters. Unfortunately, many don't want to be persuaded since their minds are already made up. And with regard to the report of the Governor's Economic Recovery Council, there were subgroups which our president named: the new industry, Oregon business climate, existing industry, tourism, and education. The membership consisted of John Eloriaga as the chairman of the U.S. National Bank, and the subgroup leaders were respectively Bill DeWeese of Catharter Technology, Doug Strain of ESI, Earl Wantlin of Tektronix, Dave Heinel of Greater Portland Convention and Visitors Association, and Bob Ingalls, retired, of the Corvallis Gazette-Times. There was a total of about 50 other members with business and or academic or government backgrounds, including 20% PhDs to keep us dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Additionally, the Wantlin Group of Two polled numerous corporate leaders as to their actual experience in the economic problems. There's a common thread in many cases. Since the subgroup chapters overlapped, we had a means of observing whether or not the results obtained were unique to a group or were in fact universal problems. There were mostly common problems and a few unique problems. And I'll quote a couple of items from the governor's report. I'm sure many of you have already read it, and many of you will read it shortly. But the main items that come out, especially in the common mode, are that Oregonians are justifiably proud of their state's warmth and hospitality towards residents and visitors alike. The same attitude needs to be extended to the business firms now residing in the state and new firms looking to Oregon for expansion and growth. The Economic Recovery Council recommends that the governor devise and institute an incentive program for public employees at all levels of government. The program should recognize and reward government employees who perform their duties in a particular and positive and helpful way. In dealing with the location or expansion of high-growth industries, the first impression made is also the only impression allowed. This incentive system should address the need to make that first impression an outstanding one. A program to reward performers not only encourages a make-it-happen attitude within the state's permitting agencies, and I'll come back to that make-it-happen in a bit, it also sends a distinct message to the businesses interested in plant location and job creation. Oregon wants jobs, and we're willing to help. In the old days, too much of the attitude was, stop the environmental exploiters. The environmental exploiters were described as anybody who came up and requested by petition the right to do most anything. I think we now need to recognize that there are indeed environmental exploiters, but everyone who comes up with a petition is not necessarily an environmental exploiter. There are good companies, and I keep coming back to the high-tech because, of course, I'm familiar with high-tech, who do indeed value their environment and who do indeed support the objectives of LCDC and so on, but can't live with the interpretations that are being made. For example, we need to minimize the location and expansion costs of industry while protecting the livability. We need the LCDC, but with the correct perspective. And the report lists many, many things which can be done as specific items. This is not just a general report that says, gee whiz, we've got to fix this. We say how to do it. For example, one specific item out of the list: direct LCDC to give priority to Goal 9 and the development diversification needs of cities and counties. And of course, Goal 9 is economic development. Streamline Oregon's permit process. On page 47, there happens to be a little item there. You may need to know that the president of the Hewlett-Packard Corporation, John Young, is an OSU graduate. And he chose to put a plant in near Corvallis, his alma mater. And he ran into a hornet's nest. They finally got their permit to build their plant, and then they needed to change the footprint a bit. And they had to go through a 1-year process to get that small footprint changed because they had to go back and go through the whole process over again. So here's a comment from Charles T. Moore, the General Manager, Personal Computation Group, Hewlett-Packard, Corvallis. Quote, while Oregonians should not and won't throw the baby out with the bathwater, the role of LCDC versus local governing bodies must be modified. Whoops, I'm sorry, I got the wrong quote there. This is William E. Love. The current land use planning procedures and designations have made the cost of land for residential development among the highest in the country. This can't continue. I got this out of sequence. That's another point I'll pick up on in just a second. Mr. Moore says, in general, our concern is that Oregon's land use planning process is too rigid and without adequate provisions for preventing a minority of citizens from overriding a particular proposal. The companies that come here are not only worried about their own land, they're worried about where their workers are going to live. And that's why the quote from Mr. Love. Another quote from Charles L. Noble, president of this, from Robert Randall, the president of the Randall Company. Time delays cost money. Time delays make planning difficult and make our state a very unattractive environment for any type of real estate development. Now I could go on reading those class of items ad nauseum, but I don't think that's at all necessary. I think you can do that on your own if you don't agree. Another important point, keep the operating costs of Oregon industry competitive by revising the tax structure to promote job growth and attract skilled individuals. Improve Oregon's worker compensation system. And of course I'm going to come back and speak more to these in a moment. But last but not least, in the summary section is education. High quality education is of critical importance to the creation of new jobs in Oregon during the 80s. Technical sophistication will increase, and employees at all levels of employment will be called upon to substitute mental skills for physical ability. Our fastest growing industries with their high technology base have the greatest needs for advanced employee education. Note, this is independent of whether or not a given company is a high-tech company. They will all use high technology in making their own businesses more efficient. Hence, we must address the educational problem not only at the graduate level for the high-tech employees who want to continue their careers and not become technically obsolete as I did, graduating the day the transistor was invented. But expecting to be able to continue their own education and of course expecting their children's education to be in good hands. Now in summary, I think we have to say that land use availability is the one point that everyone can agree upon without any trouble at all. The problem that I would summarize it as succinctly is where there's sewers, there's no clean air, and where there's clean air, there's no sewers. Some people have represented that land availability is the whole problem, but it is the necessary but not sufficient condition to get expansion of business in Oregon and attract new business to Oregon. The permit process has to be cleaned up. I mentioned Hewlett-Packard. Tektronix had the same kind of problem when they tried to put a plant in Lebanon. They had the same problem when they tried to put a plant in Gresham. They now have a plant across the river in Vancouver. Hewlett-Packard has a plant across the river in Vancouver. And I'll speak of some others who don't have a plant at all in Oregon. Infrastructure. Besides the problems mentioned above, there are a number of other items. Schools I've already mentioned. We need airports served by airlines. We need the vendor situation which supports the industries. And we need the cultural and recreational opportunities which attract the workers. Now, what are the forces of restraint here? There's something I call stiction, the force that resists an initial pull or push to get something started. The inability to recognize the difference between then and now. Now, we can't do this because then it didn't work. And finally, what I mentioned before, the necessary but not sufficient conditions. Now, let me give you some reminder examples. Stiction, Hewlett-Packard in Corvallis. The opposition there was from, surprise, surprise, the college element. The college professors there, and the humanities in particular, didn't want all this busy industry around them. They didn't want jobs created around them. They didn't want jobs for the graduates of the school. They wanted a nice, peaceful little community that they'd known for years. Tektronix in Lebanon and Gresham had the same problem. The then-now distinction. The view of some members of the press and some politicians is to equate the 9-to-1 defeat of the sales tax effort nearly 13 years ago when it was first mentioned with today's tax effort without examining the differences between then and now. I'll get back to that one. The necessary but not sufficient. There are those who believe that all we have to do is make the land available and all the other problems become trivial. Now the reason that that is not true, in spite of what some of our newspaper writers have written, is that we are no longer in the situation that we were in the late 60s and early 70s where we had essentially no competition. Oregon is no longer alone nor the only state near the Silicon Valley with airport, schools, cultural and recreational opportunities. We've got a high tax rate and an impossibly long permit process. Unlike one local prominent newspaper writer's opinion, Oregon has not gotten anywhere near its share of new and expanded existing industries. What we've gotten was largely committed to in the 74 and prior period before the escalation of our taxes or based on specialized needs or subsidies. North Carolina is about 100-to-1 over Oregon during this last 10-year period of time in getting new industries into the state. The Oregon Economic Development Agency has done well, but we haven't given them the tools to do their job effectively. The kind of conclusions I come to is that the spirit of cooperation generated by the present economic hard times crosses party lines and generates labor management common purpose goals. I'm confident that our problems of land use, permits, and education will be solved due to the cooperation of many groups, including the 1,000 Friends of Oregon, developers, government bodies, educational groups, both public and private. But will the report sit on the shelf? It certainly looks like it might, and I think we need a good leader to pick that up and run with it so that we get the job done. This is too hot a potato for the politicians. They can't get near it. Clearly, Kolingowski, too, recognized the problem some time ago when he pushed the Plant Closure Act. Things were so bad, and they're going to be worse, he knew people were going to bug out. And he wanted to stop them. That was his method, stop them from leaving. Well, that also stops them from coming. And it's certainly not a practical solution. Hopefully, most of this report was agreed to by both Governor Atiyeh and Kolingowski, with some areas where one would agree and the other one wouldn't, to be sure. But the majority of it, I believe both will agree, is correct, right, and proper, and needs attention. But there is an area right now where they both disagree with the report, and that's on the sales tax issue. Hence, it's worthy of some special attention. From my point of view, this is a call to action. We must prepare and distribute a cogent set of facts that we can use to give to those interested in promoting the need for a sales tax. Give them the tools to do the job. Convince the people, and even Kolingowski will embrace the sales tax. By a grassroots campaign, show the voters that the sales tax is not nearly as retrogressive as is represented, and that there are limits to how far progressive taxes should be carried if we are to be competitive. A sales tax which taxes food increases our tourist-derived revenues substantially. To avoid regressivity, we propose providing a cash refund to all Oregonians. It is progressive because the person who insists on eating caviar and filet mignon will not get all the taxes refunded. The person who buys a used Chevy does not pay as high a total sales tax as those who buy 2 new Caddies. There are bottom-end safety nets which didn't exist before, since there are housing subsidies, health care, and food stamps. Since nearly roughly 30% of the lower income is now spent on housing payments and 20% on food, about half of the lower income group's spending is sheltered from sales tax. Clearly, the high consumers are bearing the burden of and paying the most of a sales tax. Let's play reductio ad absurdum. Let's have no sales tax or property tax. Let's exclude everyone under $1 million from being taxed. There would be no millionaires in Oregon in a very short time. There would then be very likely fewer jobs. What most people overlook is that profitable entities are not mostly rip-off artists. They are by far the providers of the community well-being, a synergistic combination of business, community, and government. Oregon, in its timber agribusiness heyday, could rip off, with an unbalanced tax structure, these businesses. We now find they aren't paying the freight. The 2.5 million housing starts per year in the 70s are likely gone. And I've got a lot of reasons for that I won't take the time for, but it has to do with the baby boom and the singles business. If we follow some columnist leads, we should again sock the rich. Let's do it differently. Let's let the rich voluntarily pay more by taxing their spending, or encourage them to invest more and make more jobs. Let's let the tourists help us too. Let's show present Oregon business and potential business that Oregon has a downtrend in property and corporate taxes, not up as in the past. If anyone thinks for a minute, quote, that companies pay taxes, let's tax them more, if they think that's true, they're very naive. Customers pay taxes, or the company goes out of business for lack of profits. A company taxed more than its competition is soon in trouble or building out of state. And good examples of that are Intel and Hyster. Intel came into Oregon in '74 when the tax rate was reasonable. They have now calculated that of all their plants, the Oregon plant is the highest taxed. Hyster has made a study. Oregon is the highest taxed of their plants. And anyone else will find the same. All our TV stations were fair in their coverage of the press conference and the governor's report. But one commentator, I distinguish from the reporters, one commentator amused me. He stated that the sales tax was just a business plot to raise money to fund industrial development publicity out of state. Obviously, the magnitudes don't match up. Why the error? Snap judgment without checking with anyone. The same commentator accused the group of getting their answers quickly by jumping to the easy answers, which he did, of course, in his opinion of the purpose of the sales tax. The reason the report was done quickly was that the people involved had been dealing with the problems day by day for years. They knew precisely what the troubles were. All they had to do was have somebody ask. We can no longer contemplate killing the goose to get at the golden eggs. We must get the voters to understand things are different internally and externally to Oregon. This tax is coupled to a reduction in both property and income tax constitutionally. Hence, it is a replacement tax, not a new tax, as the last attempt was, wherein the property tax was reduced but income tax increased. Clearly, we will not benefit in economic development with a sales tax, but we'll put a floor under schools clearly not only will we benefit in economic development with a sales tax, but we'll also put a floor under schools, since property tax cash will be helped with a sales tax, which gets paid. Remember, very often property taxes are deferred, and that's what causes the cash crunch. Programs can be planned and continued, not stop, start, which is a very uneconomical way to run a railroad, let alone a school. There's nothing in the Constitution which guarantees everyone a free lunch. Jimmy Carter said life is not fair, but we should progress as much as we can without killing the goose to be sure that our neighbors who need a free lunch can get it and that they are treated fairly, but not to the long-term detriment of that same neighbor. It is far better that our neighbors have jobs so they can pay taxes and buy their own lunch. What can you do to help? Send the Economic Recovery Committee a list of people you know up and down the state, east and west, who will help by holding coffee clutches, address service clubs, anything to get the word out. We also need a non-political leader who can rally the many different groups that are all working this problem from different directions and pull them together. We can do it, we must do it, or stagnate. The auto dealers, amongst others, won't like this at first blush, but I'll bet their business is down more due to lack of jobs and interest rates than it may be due to a 5% sales tax. It is in everyone's interest to get jobs. One local newspaper writer insisted that it won't work. This is dead wrong. Massachusetts, formerly known as Taxatusis, changed their ways under the prodding of the Massachusetts High Technology Council, and they reversed the flee the state trend. You may remember all the textile industry that went out of there And when that got followed by the high-tech companies leaving, that's when they got with it, and they have reversed the trend, and Massachusetts is now a growing industrial state instead of a diminishing state. This argument that this won't work is very similar, I'm reminded, of the Treasury Department of the United States when it was suggested that we reduce the capital gains tax. The Treasury Department said, "Oh, you can't do that. You'll reduce our revenues at a bad time." In fact, the law was changed, and in fact, the revenues for capital gains increased, much to the Treasury's astonishment. And of course, what they forgot was a high tax on nothing doesn't produce as much revenue as a low tax on something. If you're with us, let's get going. Thank you.
Now it's time for questions. The first question will be asked by our board host, Phil Bogue.
I'm particularly interested in higher education in the 20-some years I've lived in Portland. You know, we're a small state. We have a population of less than 3 million. The 2nd Congressional District, if I may recall my facts correctly, is 3rd in the nation in terms of the number of colleges and universities within its boundaries. We have 6 state colleges. I would be interested if your committee had any specific suggestions on how we're going to improve the educational at the higher education level from the standpoint that you're talking about.
Well, the report addresses that question from many points of view. The report will sound chauvinistic at first in that it recommends that we simplify our system and that we move the center towards the Portland area. And although this sounds chauvinistic, it is an economic reality. The action is up here in terms of growing industries. The action is up here in terms of the need for advanced degrees. This problem is not only addressed by the Governor's Economic Recovery Council report, but it's also being worked on by the Oregon chapter of the American Electronics Association. They specifically have a subcommittee which is addressing the higher education level part of the problem. Many of the educational groups that I've talked with are also very concerned about the lower levels in the lack of the number of competent science and math teachers, and the concern that we won't be encouraging our young people to get themselves educated in these years because they have no role model to follow. Unfortunately, Phil, I'm not an expert on the educational area because I felt that was in good hands, but I do know enough about it to feel confident that their recommendations point us in the correct direction.
In the center of the room there is a microphone. Questions are the privilege of City Club members only. Please state your name and briefly state your question for the speaker.
Sally McCracken, member. I haven't read the report, unfortunately. I will. Now that I know that I can get it at U.S. Bank?
U.S. Bank.
U.S. Bank.
Main office.
My question about the specifics on the sales tax that you're promoting, is it going to be a constitutional provision? I have about come to the conclusion that we're destined for a sales tax, particularly if Ray Phillips and his friends get us past this a 1.5% property tax limitation. And people object, saying that we'll do just like in Washington and they'll keep raising it. And I think that question is very important. I'd like you to spell out the specifics. Prescription drugs, those kinds of things.
I'm glad you asked that question. Honest, it wasn't a plant. Indeed, if the 1.5% limitation passes, we will almost certainly have to have a sales tax. The actual proposed legislation is not finished. It is being considered as a constitutional amendment in order that the legislature cannot jack the amount around. It is definitely intended to be a replacement tax, unlike the time before. You recall last time it was called a replacement for the property tax, but in fact the income tax was raised. For that reason, it was not supported by business, it was not supported by labor. The educational side could support it, of course, because that would be a great deal of help in terms of funding of the schools. This particular constitutional amendment is being proposed as a reduction in both the both the property tax and the income tax as truly a replacement tax and not an additional tax. And that way we believe we can get the backing and the support of education, the educational unions, labor, business alike. We think when people get the rhetoric out of it and start studying what it really means, they'll be with us.
Before the next questioner, I'm informed that you can get a copy of the Governor's Economic Recovery Council report by calling a number from which they will mail the report. If you have a cuff or something that you can write this phone on, it's 225-4874. If you will call, they will then mail you a copy of the report. 225-4874. Steve?
Steve Shell, member. Mr. Winningstad, I'm interested in institutional structures that have been undertaken in various places. Particularly, what do you see the role of the Oregon Graduate Center in as this program? How does the Science and Engineering Board work in North Carolina? And what is this High Technology Council that you've mentioned in Massachusetts?
The American Electronics Association did a good job representing the high-tech industry nationally, and in the state of California it's based. But it does not do as high a quality a job in all the different states as they do in California. So the Massachusetts folks, which was a hotbed of high-tech activity, formed their own High Technology Institute to do the job in the state of Massachusetts. I hope that answers that one for you. Let's see, the next one was with regard to the
Science and Engineering Board.
Science and Engineering Board. This is part of the task force recommendation that we create this board in order that they can specifically make recommendations to the school systems. Now, I think, frankly, that the reason this came about is that we now have a situation where the schools are coming to industry and saying, look, we're not getting our state budget. We are having a great deal of difficulty holding qualified professors in the areas that are of interest to the high-tech companies. How on earth are we going to hold these professors? How can we get our programs going? Can't you fund us? And the answer is yes. We'll do our best to do some funding, but of course we want to have a voice in what it is we're funding and what is accomplished with the money. See, for too long, the higher educational system in the state of Oregon, mostly downstate, took the attitude of, well, what do you want from us, industry? And we'd tell them, and then they'd go do what they wanted because, of course, they knew exactly what they wanted to do anyway. Now it's a little different. It's a little more touchy times, and we think that now the guidance sought will be listened to a great deal more closely, and so we have to have a forum to furnish that voice. The Oregon Graduate Center and the Triangle Research Park in North Carolina. The Triangle Research Park in North Carolina, as you may know, was formed, and its name Triangle comes from the three universities that form the apex of the triangle. And within that area, industry was encouraged to develop research and development operations as opposed to production operations. And this Triangle Research Park was carefully arranged so that people could quickly get building permits and could quickly proceed in their business there. Unlike Digital Equipment Corporation and Data General Corporation, who both tried to come into Oregon, locate in Eugene, and they said, each of them separately at different times, we want to spend $5 million now to create an engineering organization, and then later we want to spend $20 million to build a manufacturing and business unit around the engineering project. Where can we build? Now understand that a company like Digital Equipment Corporation went from 1.8 billion a year to 2.4 billion a year 1 year later. That's $800 million of increase in 1 year. That's approximately 16,000 new jobs by electronic standards, about $50,000 sales per employee. We missed out on that opportunity because we could not tell them where to build. None of those companies can build in advance. They start projecting their needs about 2 to 3 years out so that they have time to study where they want to locate, build it, and start it operating. They don't have time to fool around arguing with little protest groups. We need to iron that out ahead of time, have it all straightened out as North Carolina did in their Triangle Research Park. Now, this is precisely what the Oregon Graduate Center is attempting to do. They, on a mini cosmic scale, are proposing the beginning of a small research park of I think it's something like 160 to 300 acres, depending upon which phase you're talking about. And there are groups around it, the so-called Sunset Strip along Sunset Highway, which will act as backups for the manufacturing and office and administration part of it. So I think that when I said a little while ago, I see the sun coming up over the clouds and the breakout here in the sense that we will solve our land availability problem, we will solve our permitting problem, we will solve our educational problem. I think that the tax problem is the one that remains and takes the tough part. But I believe it's absolutely correct that the Oregon Graduate Center is being a real leader and a real point person to get out there and get this kind of a movement going. But again, let me emphasize, I think that Oregon needs more than just high tech. We need to keep our tourist industry growing, our agri-industry healthy, and our timber industry healthy, as well as other items.
Is there another question? Good.
Norm, currently income and property taxes are deductible against federal income tax, and there seems to be a movement afoot to deny or change the current deduction for sales taxes. Did your committee take that into consideration?
Unfortunately, I can't speak to that. I'm not deep enough into that to be able to answer it, Wayne. I kind of regret that, of course. I will mention, by the way, that one of our problems in Oregon is the incompatibility of the Oregon tax system and the federal system. And as a result, our companies are burdened with keeping multiple sets of books to keep depreciation and other such schedules separately for Oregon and Washington. And this is another cost of business that we've got going due to the misalignment of Oregon and federal taxes.
Next question.
Vicki Flaumer. I'm president of the Oregon chapter of APA, City Club member, and also an economic planner. First of all, I'd like to thank you for giving your time and expertise in trying to make our community, our states, and our lives a little better. But I have to follow up on a statement that you said, referring, I think too often that the Department of Land Conservation and Development has become a convenient scapegoat as a major barrier to economic development. And too often one side is presented or isolated cases, when in fact the intent of the state program was to set aside enough sufficient land and to establish the guidelines so that developers and so that industry would know what the rules were, would know where to locate industry, and to make, essentially to make the land use in our communities better.
Do you have a question?
The question is, could you comment? Do you feel that there's another side to the Corvallis, the Clark County experience?
I'm sorry if I offended you or got under your skin a little bit, but I thought I did mention that the high-tech companies in particular, and most all reasonable businesses, do support LCDC and its goals. We think that the problem is that the emphasis has been misdirected. Too often the early membership of groups such as that, and in particular I can think of the early days of DEQ, when Floating Point had a serious problem, the attitude of the functionaries who administer this system was to stop everybody. Don't let them do anything. Now that attitude has changed remarkably over the years, and in fact Governor Straub was the first to help get DEQ turned around a little bit, and Governor T has continued that. The organizations are much more reasonable now than they were, but the point is we have to create a can-do attitude in these agencies. Instead of just saying, no, you can't do that, offer some advice as to how you can someplace else or some other way. And also, I think very often there's a good deal of judgmental movement possible in ruling by these groups as to whether it is a conforming or a non-conforming use, and whether or not it can really go here or it can't go there. And those kinds of judgments can cause terrible delays. Further than that, there's a lot of blackmail involved, not necessarily in LCDC, but in other groups in granting permits. They'll say, yeah, you can go in there provided you do this. And they know darn well that they aren't required by law to do that, and they could take it to the courts and not have to do it, but that would be a 2-year delay. So I think what we have to do is to do what the committee recommends. Get an incentive system in it so that the functionaries will be in the direction of helping people to get things done, but in conformity with LCDC and its goals. It's a matter of perspective as to what the goals mean and how they should be applied.
I don't see another question immediately, but I will exercise the prerogative of the chair and ask a question myself. One of the LCDC goals is for citizen involvement in the process of land use allocation. Could it be that citizen involvement is partially responsible for some of the interminable delays that industry has been experiencing?
The present setup of citizen involvement, I think, is good, proper, and in the formulation of the general guidelines and where the zoning boundaries go and so on, it's absolute necessity. However, the system, unfortunately, doesn't have a stopping point for citizen involvement. Once you have declared an area to be such and so, we should then not have it possible for a single person to force a complete rehearing, force a case through the courts, force interminable delays based on the whim of one person or even a small group of persons. If the Economic Development Commission of the state and the Portland Development Commission and everybody else is going along saying these are good projects, we should have them here, and they allocate some land. Let's take the Oregon Graduate Center case. When it gets all zoned and all agreed and all sewered and all DEQ'd, then we shouldn't have to go through the humongous process which is laid out, a review and so on, which is possible now. And it is suggested that we set up a scheme wherein we have, instead of these kinds of difficult hearings, set it up so that we have a simple thing called a compliance hearing. And at the compliance hearing, you show whether or not you're in compliance with the intended use and the regulations, and if you are, it goes ahead and there is no complaint possible.
At the microphone.
Chris Tobkin, Executive Director. When the City Club started this kind of economic series last fall, Ralph Shaw spoke to us. He was fairly critical of the Portland area financial and legal community's inability to muster the cash, the capital, and the financial legal advice to entrepreneurs to get some of these kind of projects started. Assuming that we straighten out the problems you've just mentioned, as someone who's formed his own company, how do you view the venture capital climate in the state, and how easy will it be for companies to form, particularly spin-offs from existing high-tech industries?
Well, I'm very pleased to say to you that since Floating Point got started in the late 1970s, early 1970s, The situation is grossly different. The capital gains tax laws were increased in '69 to ordinary income tax, and the venture capital market literally dried up. Then the American Electronics Association and the Venture Capital Institution got together and formed a campaign which culminated in reducing the capital gains tax to a lower rate. The result of that has been a flood of venture capital available for high technology companies. And in the case of high tech companies that spin off, they have very little trouble in getting what I would call the venture capital level of money. Now this is roughly $500,000 and up. But the little seeding companies must in general find their own capital for the very beginning, the feasibility studies, the prototype building, this kind of thing. Now this has to be raised through friends, relatives, your dentist, your doctor, your accountant, your lawyer. Somebody has to put up the first $50,000, $100,000 that makes the feasibility study possible, because in general the venture capital people are interested in funding production, not pie in the sky. So I think it is not a difficult problem for someone who really has a good idea. Now in the high-tech area, the only people I hear complaining about not being able to raise money are the companies I wouldn't put a nickel in. You know, the guy has got the perpetual motion machine, and all he's got to do is build a bigger one and it'll really work. Now, there are many other areas besides high-tech though, and it is much, much more difficult to raise significant amounts of venture capital for non-high-tech operations, and I think we need those too. But fortunately, most of the high-tech ventures don't need big hunks of money. They can generally get along with smaller amounts. But I don't think financing of genuinely good ideas when led by genuinely good people is a problem. You see, not only are you worried about what the idea is as to whether or not you'd invest a nickel in it, it's also who's doing it. And high tech is, I've heard referred to like granola. When you get the fruits and nuts out, all that's left are the flakes. Now, seriously, high tech as a cross section is not much different from any other business cross section, except the high-tech people tend to be very sharp in the physical sciences, very determined, and very know-it-all, because, you know, people have told them you couldn't do that, and they've got this prototype that does it. See, they're wrong. So when they try to give business advice, that business advice frequently is not taken. And so that's one of the serious problems of trying to finance a high-tech company, is that the technical guru will not listen to the business side of it. So I think the problems of getting venture capital for small companies is more with a small company than it is with the availability of money. I know Wayne will like that.
I think we have one more question down here. Don, did you have a question?
Don Sterling just went and said, speaking of sewers, most of the infrastructure that would be required for what you're talking about is not paid for by the state, it's paid for by local government out of the property tax. How would your tax proposal deal with that?
The questioner asked how Mr. Winningstad's tax proposal would deal with the fact that most of the infrastructure, sewers, etc., is paid for out of local government taxes.
Well, this is the beauty of it. This is much like the problem with education. A good deal of the property tax money goes into education, of course, and this is why I feel strongly that we need the sales tax to put a floor underneath the funding of education, because as people can't afford to pay their property tax, there's a cash flow deficit. The sales tax will fill that in. Same thing is true on county services. I live in Washington County, and believe me, I've seen budget cuts and programs up, down, and sideways. And I sincerely hope that this sales tax will go through so that Washington County will have a little bit better ability to plan their fiscal future around half a sales tax and half a property tax than they do now, where the results are stochastic almost. So I think that the counties will be better able to plan their future and know when they can put the 185th Street intercept in, and when Newt Cavalli's Five Oaks park can be put on sewer line. See, one of the problems Floating Point had was, and where I came up with this, where there's clean air, there's no sewers, and where there's sewers, there's no clean air, is we wanted to move into a beautiful tract across 217 from Washington Square. Beautiful, absolutely great. But we couldn't park 2,000 cars there because Washington Square was already parking cars. Of course, they neglected that our cars don't move but once a day, and Washington Squares move every 3/4 of an hour or so. That doesn't make any difference, DEQ in those days. Now, we moved to a different place, but we wanted to go to New Cavallius Five Oaks Park. It was beautiful out Sunset Highway. The air was magnificently clean way out there. The only catch was the sewer wasn't in yet. Now, Washington County is getting the sewer in little by little and slowly but surely, but I think it's certainly a lot more surely if you've got a budget you can plan around based on the sales tax contribution.
Thank you, Mr. Winningstead. May I remind you of next week's meeting with David Paradine, Executive Director of United Way. We're adjourned.